Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the second of our four Lunch and Learn presentations. My name is Bill Hesser, Director of Strategic Communications for the College of the Liberal Arts, and it's now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Scott Bennett. Scott?
Great. Thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a nice sunny day in State College, and I hope it is where you are also. We haven't had enough of those here. On behalf of Dean Lang and everybody associated with the college, welcome to the second of our four presentations by our liberal arts faculty exploring different dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic. For those of you who joined us last week for Tima's presentation, thanks for joining us again. I hope you find today's presentation just as thought-provoking. And for those of you joining us for the first time, we're really delighted that you could sign in. These presentations are a great opportunity to showcase the relevant and timely research taking place in the college about the current moment. These research projects that we are talking about allow us to better understand and respond to one of the most pressing issues, and indeed many pressing issues, that we have facing society with the COVID and even more recent events. Our discussion in this research reinforces the important role of the liberal arts in tackling these issues in terms of creative thinking, critical thinking, considering diverse viewpoints and scientific hypotheses, communicating articulately, and thinking about the interventions and actions that we can take individually or in groups to address the challenges that we see. So thanks for your interest in these presentations and for your ongoing engagement with the college. Quick reminder about our two remaining presentations. So next Wednesday, June 17th, Ray Block, Professor of Political Science and African American Studies, will be discussing race, politics, and the pandemic, mobilizing voters for the 2020 election. And Barry Ickes, professor and head of our Department of Economics, will close out the series on Thursday, June 25th, by discussing economic recovery from COVID-19. Those presentations will also begin at 12:05 Eastern Time, and so we hope you can join us. But recordings of all four of our series presentations will be available on the Penn State College of Liberal Arts YouTube channel. And as for today, there'll be time following Kristin's 15 to 20-minute presentation. So please submit your questions using the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring the page through this hour, so you're welcome to submit your questions anytime. So let me introduce today's speaker. Kristin Buss is Professor of Psychology and Human Development and Family Studies. And on July 1st, she'll officially take the title as the Tracy Winfrey and Ted H. McCourtney Professor in Children, Work, and Families. That's terrific recognition of Kristin's research and stature in the field, so congratulations, Kristin. And I work with Kristin a lot as head of our Department of Psychology, and so she's wearing many hats and many titles these days, and we're glad she could join us. Kristin received her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She completed a postdoc in affective neuroscience in 2001. She came to Penn State in 2006, following 5 years at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Her research explores emotional development and temperamental variations in children from birth to adolescence. Her current work focuses on the development of risk for adjustment problems, with particular emphasis on the development of social anxiety symptoms for children with fearful temperaments. In doing all of that work, Kristin's been a prolific scholar with well over 100 publications in the form of articles, book chapters, commentaries, abstracts, and conference proceedings, and she's co-editor of 2 volumes on emotional development and child development. Kristin's been a faculty affiliate of the Child Studies Center since arriving at Penn State, and she's also serving as the director of the Emotion Development Lab in the department. In 2007, she worked closely with other faculty to establish Parents and Children Together, or PACT, a research initiative housed in Harrisburg that works to promote the health and well-being of children, youth, and families from diverse backgrounds through culturally sensitive and community-engaged research projects. She's been co-director and then single director of that initiative. So we're delighted that Kristin could join us today to discuss the development of social anxiety and who, how, and what must be done about it. Kristin?
Thanks, Scott. And thank you everybody for attending today. And I'm really happy to be here to talk generally about the work I do, and then specifically why the work I do is important to consider at the time where we are right now with the pandemic and with other things that are going on in our world right now. It's important. I think a lot of what I'll be talking about today is not changed very much in the last 6 months. It's only been heightened, and hopefully I'll give you a flavor for what I do, and it'll set up a chance for you to ask me some questions that are more specific about what's happening right now. So one of the things I do want to say at the outset is that as a developmental scientist, being at Penn State is amazing. Coming to Penn State was a no-brainer for me. We are one of the top 5 universities in the world in terms of developmental science, and you'll get a little flavor for the some of the things that I've been able to do. And Scott already mentioned PACT and the opportunity that that affords that is unique again to Penn State. We'll talk a little bit about that. So I'll just jump right on in and talk a little bit about anxiety. And we probably all know kids who are anxious. We may also think it's becoming a larger problem than it was when we were younger, or even when we were raising our kids. And that is absolutely the case. It's not just a feeling you have. It's not just more media attention being placed on anxiety. It absolutely is increasing. It's increasing across development. And this includes college students as well. We're seeing dramatic increases in the amount of anxiety that we see as kids enter college. And I'm sure you all know people for whom this is a real issue, either friends that you have who has a child who's struggling with it, or perhaps somebody in your own family. Anxiety disorders, and in particular the one that I study, which is social anxiety disorder, are the most prevalent psychiatric disorders in children and adolescents. And they result in real impairment for children and put them at risk for other disorders like depression and substance use. Next slide, Bill. The development of these disorders are very complex and multifaceted. Today, I'm really going to focus mainly on 2 pieces of this slide that I have here, but we will be touching on all 3. I should also let you know that there are other factors here, but I'm trying to, sort of focus what I'm talking about just on these 3 factors. First, I'm going to spend some time talking about fearful temperament, which Scott mentioned in the introduction. And then I'm going to shift to talk a little bit about community risks, not only because it's something that's being highlighted right now in our world, but also because it's something that my research has taken me towards over the last few years. Broadly, my interests are really in understanding how these early emerging paths to anxiety, if you will, put children, either keep them on that path towards anxiety, or for which kids are they less likely to develop anxiety. And we'll talk a little bit about what are the things that we can do to get kids off that negative trajectory. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about why anxiety matters. And especially when I start talking about the fearful temperament profile of kids that I study, because these kids could be misconstrued as kids who are just shy. And you might think, okay, well, maybe they'll just grow out of it. Maybe hiding behind mom or dad's legs when they approach something new is okay. And you'd be right, that is okay. What we also know is that there are good types of anxiety and bad types of anxiety. I'm really trying to understand the bad type, right? The type that leads kids down a path of real impairment. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So let me give you a little bit of example of good anxiety. So right now, it's really adaptive to be anxious about the pandemic. It keeps us safe, right? So if you're anxious about getting infected, you stay home or you wear a mask, you socially distance, you physically distance from others. That's a good type of anxiety. It's that emotion that, you know, bubbles up at a potential threat. The bad type of anxiety is when we have anxiety, we have those same feelings of avoidance of threat when there's not real threat present, or when the threat is so far removed from us that there's no need to be anxious about it. Those are the kids that I'm worried about. So back to what I said about the shy kid. Imagine here where I say early life risk, all of these different children that are represented by different color heads here. And all of these, imagine all of these kids fall into the category of what we would say shy. So they're a little bit more reserved than other kids. They're less outgoing. As we move forward in developmental time, what you see here in this graphic is that none of the kids with blue heads are longer in that category, right? They're no longer experiencing what we would call problematic anxiety. Maybe a few of the orange kids are, and it's mostly these yellow kids. So the crux of what I do in my work and have done for the last 20 years is try to identify what are the characteristics of both the children who are represented by these yellow stick figures, what are their characteristics, and what are the factors that keep them on that negative trajectory towards anxiety. And what we know about these types of kids is that they experience extreme fear and distress in social situations. And that leads to avoidance. So imagine a 4-year-old girl standing in the corner watching other kids play during the free play time at preschool. Or a 9-year-old boy who doesn't want to go to a friend's birthday party because there will be kids he doesn't know there. Or a 13-year-old girl who doesn't speak up to contribute to a conversation that's required for a group project in middle school. These are the real consequences of anxiety for kids. So at minimum, ignoring these early symptoms or risk factors increases the possibility that these kids will end up with impairing disorders. So it's important to intervene really early. Next slide, please. The other thing I do to try to understand who these kids are is to try to find at the center of this, Venn diagram I've pointed to the highest anxiety risk, is a combination of the behaviors that these kids show, the sort of biological and cognitive factors that are associated with that behavior, and also their environmental risk. In one of the earlier slides I showed you, I talked about sort of parenting and parent factors, as well as sort of community level risk factors. So by environment, I mean both of those things. So we can identify really early, and in my research, I've shown that we can identify who these kids are as early as 24 months, 2 years of age. And we've been able to show that a certain pattern of behavior coupled with some physiological markers of stress predict which kids are going to be most at risk for social anxiety. Next slide, please. In particular, what I have shown is it's not how much fear that these kids show, but it's when they show the fear. So remember earlier I gave you an example of good anxiety and bad anxiety. And good anxiety would be, I'm showing anxiety when there's a real threat. What's unique about these kids is these kids tend to show the anxiety and fear and avoidance to what we call low threat situations. These are situations that other 2-year-olds approach. So a Penn State example would be the Nittany Lion, right? He's at a game and all the kids are running around. They want to see him. They're chasing him around the stadium. But your kid is holding back. Not that that's necessarily unusual, but it's one of the indicators that maybe this child's different than other children, okay? And what I've shown now across 2 samples, is that these types of children are 4 times more likely to develop anxiety symptoms as they transition to kindergarten, as they transition into early adolescence, so the middle school years, so 11 to 13. And then now I have a study that we're in year 2 of, where we are looking at changes in anxiety symptoms from early adolescence through middle to later adolescence, to try and characterize what's happening for these kids, and what factors are associated with being high and stable in that anxiety risk. And interestingly, right now, we have added on a COVID-19 study to this study, where we are trying to track how anxiety symptoms might be, we hope, temporarily changing, elevated for all kids, and then be able to examine for which kids it sort of settles back down to normal, as opposed to which kids will stay elevated in anxiety because of the pandemic. And we're looking at things like family, parent losing their job, somebody in the household getting sick, changes in their school structure, difficulties, engaging in the normal behaviors that they've been able to engage in. And anecdotally, my son just finished his sophomore year at State High, and he's on track to play baseball in college, and it's disrupted that trajectory for him. So we want to understand how these disruptions in everyday life now are affecting these typical patterns of anxiety. Now we know they're going to be elevated for most kids. Okay, next slide, please. I want to transition a bit to talking about environmental risk. And COVID-19 pandemic is one of these major events that's taking place around the world that's affecting all of us. And I want us to be keeping in mind in this figure that the children that I'm interested in studying are embedded within a family context, within a neighborhood context, and within a community context, and nationally, globally. You could keep going on and on. But the reason we're interested in how the environment shapes the child is because the child is part of that environment. It's not like the environment's over here and what the child brings is over here. It's constantly shaping. It's constantly impinging on what the child's exposed to, experiencing, etc. And I'm really excited to be sharing this research with you, because this is sort of the newest part of my research program. And again, something I wouldn't have been able to do had I not come to Penn State, and had I not been part of starting the PACT initiative down in Harrisburg. What we do in that initiative is we engage the community to address questions that are both important to us as researchers and important to the community. And I spent a lot of time talking to the community, doing focus groups, and understanding what their concerns were around anxiety. And I think it's pretty obvious right now why community level risk is important to understand when we think about anxiety, not only with COVID-19 and the pandemic and the disparities that has highlighted in our communities, such that poor, underserved communities are being more heavily impacted by COVID-19 than our other communities. And then what happened in the last 2 weeks as well, with all of the rioting and the protests and the upheaval around what happened in Minneapolis. These things differentially impact kids depending on the communities in which they live. So a lot of the stuff I was talking about earlier in my talk is really what we know generally about kids. Now we really want to understand what we know about anxiety for kids who are at high risk because of chronic stress exposure. What we do know from our work and others is that community stress, chronic stress like poverty, violence in the community, low resources, so food deserts, other things like that, that are often go together in inner city and in some cases really rural communities, is that the stress of the community overwhelms the effects of fearful temperament. Not that there aren't fearful kids in those contexts, but it's not the child's characteristics that are driving their pathway to anxiety. It's the community risk factors that tend to drive the development of anxiety in those cases. Next slide, please. So in an earlier study that we did a few years ago, we did this in Harrisburg. We were really interested in understanding what the links were between community level risk factors and mothers or parents own, but largely it's mothers, own anxiety and their child's anxiety during the preschool period. And we did this because we were really interested in trying to develop a preventive intervention to improve kids' chances as they transition to kindergarten. And what we did is we surveyed about 60 families in 2 Head Start schools in Harrisburg. And these schools were identified as being among the most high risk, situated within the most high risk neighborhoods in Harrisburg. And what I've put on this slide demonstrates that these preschoolers who are in the orange bars here are experiencing a lot of anxiety in comparison to, so the gray bars are a comparison group of low risk preschoolers from low risk communities, which are more along the lines of what we would typically see. We don't see a lot of anxiety symptoms in preschoolers, but in these schools in Harrisburg, we absolutely do, especially separation anxiety. So this is the type of anxiety about leaving the home and worrying about what's going to happen to my parents when I'm not there, kind of anxiety. And so that really told us and our community partners that we needed to do something. We needed to learn more about the exposure of community risk for these kids if we were going to intervene. Next slide, please. And in this is from the exact same study. And what we found here is that the reports that mothers gave us of their neighborhood risk, so this one slide just represents a report of crime. So this is violence, vandalism, theft in the immediate neighborhood, not Harrisburg as a whole, but right around the few blocks that the family lives. Does that affect child's anxiety? It does. However, when we add mom's own symptoms in, what we find is that it's through mom's anxiety that the children are experiencing their own anxiety. And this makes a lot of sense. So what we've learned so far is that these kids are under a lot of stress, they're experiencing a lot of anxiety, and maybe parents can help. So that's why we are doing this new study. Next slide, please. Which is called Brave Transitions to Kindergarten. And I'm doing this study with Karen Bierman, who's many of you are probably familiar with. She's the director of the Child Study Center. And Karen's expertise is in school readiness. And she has a number of interventions that show that improving kids' social, emotional, and learning readiness in preschool helps them make good transitions to kindergarten and to early elementary school. And we've partnered and added some interest in seeing if we can do the same thing by reducing anxiety and stress in these kids. We are waiting to hear if we're going to get a grant from NIH to conduct this intervention, but we've also had generous support from Dick Hayes to get this study off the ground, and that's very much appreciated. So what we're doing in this study is we're going to take a sample of pre-K kids. So this is the year right before they start kindergarten in Head Start schools in 4 schools in Harrisburg and Steelton, Pennsylvania, where the children transition from that school right into kindergarten. So they stay in their pre-K in the same building and everything. So we'll be able to really follow them. And what you see here, and I apologize that the text might be a little small, but I want to just highlight that what we're doing is we're going to be supporting parents in supporting their children, and helping parents teach their children about emotions and how to control their emotions, how to reduce their stress, increase their social skills and problem solving. And we're doing this by using Karen's newly established Go Pals intervention, and we're going to add some anxiety specific things to it. We basically will be giving parents 15 weeks of materials, and we'll visit the home 4 times. And we're hoping that this is going to show real effects as kids begin to transition to kindergarten. And the good news is that if we find evidence, as Karen has in her long an amazing career, that this will help, then we'll be able to really roll this out to schools really quickly. It'll be an intervention that could be done at very low cost. So I'm going to stop there because I think there's a lot of things for us to talk about, especially with respect to what parents can do more generally, and now where we are in our world. So I thank you for your attention. Thank you for letting me share with you a little bit about what I do.
Great, thank you, Kristin. So we will open up to questions. As a reminder, at the bottom of your Zoom screen is a Q&A window, or Q&A button that you can click and open a window and enter some questions, and I'll be happy to ask those. So I know we want to turn to the pandemic pretty quickly, but before we turn to the pandemic specifically, are there a handful of specific interventions by parents or specific techniques by parents that we could think of as in general helping with anxiety? And then maybe we can transition to how would those be applicable or not in the current moment.
Right. Yeah, there absolutely are. So a lot of the work that's being done with parents around anxiety, although not exclusively, a lot of it is preventive, right? We identify the kids who we think are going to be at risk, like the fearful kids that I talked about, and we work with the parents in addition to the kids, rather than waiting until there's anxiety and doing an intervention. And one of the things that we've found in our work is that parents who step in too quickly, are comfort and protect in situations where their kids don't need to, those are the kids who end up with more anxiety. You might be thinking, wait a minute, that's counterintuitive. If I support my kid and I protect them and I comfort them, shouldn't that be a good thing? What we know is that it's only a good thing when children are really at risk or are experiencing real threats. So way back to one of the original things I talked about, I gave the example of the 9-year-old boy who doesn't want to go to the birthday party because there's going to be kids he doesn't know. One of the things parents can do there is let him talk through his feelings, but gently convince him that he should go and experience that new thing. The parents who tend to, okay, you don't have to, and comfort their kids in those situations are inadvertently reinforcing the anxiety. And the parents are reinforcing their own behavior too. Because if I'm comforting my child, then I don't have to listen to them be upset and worried, and that brings down my anxiety as a parent too. So we see that there's this pattern, this cycle that we have to break up. I'm an anxious kid, I trigger my mom's anxiety, she responds by protecting me, and then the whole thing builds to more and more anxiety. So what we teach parents to do is not step in. Let their kids struggle through things that aren't going to be dangerous. And that's why it sort of gets us back to making a distinction between what's real threat and what's just this imagined threat.
Okay. So at a certain point, so pre-intervention sounds great. Working early sounds great. At a certain point in time, people have symptoms and have I'll say real anxiety, not that the earlier anxiety is not, but
Right.
serious, impactful anxiety.
Right.
And we've certainly had discussions about medications. And this is something that affects us with our college student population, that more students come to college with medication. Perhaps they don't keep up with it, and then we see challenges with students. So what are your views of kind of behavioral interventions versus drugs, other medical kinds of interventions?
Yeah, so I do think there are cases where medical and medication interventions are necessary, for a couple of reasons. One, it could be it just takes the edge off and allows the person to function in a way that they can get to work, they can get to school, they can do the work that they need to do. But medicine in isolation isn't going to be enough. And in fact, most of the research would show that the best outcomes have to include some intervention like behavioral intervention, cognitive behavioral therapy, or some other therapy. And the reason being is that if a person understands and learns how to deal with what their triggers are and how to cope with their anxiety, they're going to be better off with or without the medication. So I'm not against medication, but it's not an easy fix. And as we know with medications, people get used to them, their side effects, and they tend to, if they feel better, they go off them. You kind of alluded to that already, Scott. But the best strategies are usually some combination of, learning what it is that makes me anxious. And I'll give you just a quick anecdote. I did my first sabbatical at NIMH, working with Daniel Pine, who runs one of the branches on anxiety. And he let me sit in on post interviews with kids who had gone through one of his treatment studies. And it was really striking to me that the children who were doing better were the children who could articulate why they were anxious and how they were, dealing with it. So that speaks to that behavioral, that therapeutic treatment, in addition to, and most of these kids were also medicated.
Okay. So can you tell us, so we've talked generally about this as a growing problem, and anxiety materializes in different age groups and different subpopulations, I'm sure at different rates. Can you give us a sense of the numbers? What percentage of children nationally demonstrate profound social anxiety? And do we know yet how the pandemic has presumably increased those numbers, or is it too early to know?
So to the first point, we see clinically probably about, I would say, 30% of all kids, across, the entire population of, in this case, the United States, I'll base this on, show clinically significant symptoms of social anxiety by the time they're in adolescence. If you're talking about kids who meet criteria, we're talking about 10 to 15%. In comparison to depression, which is about half of that. Right. So early on, I said it's the most significant psychiatric disorder. If we're talking about behaviors that interfere, not just anxiety, it is between 30 and, 40% of kids. So it's quite prevalent. To your second question about whether or not we're seeing increases, absolutely we are. If you track some sources, which I've been doing a little bit, there have been a rise in reports. Our clinic is getting more intake. I know CAPS is getting more intake around anxiety, but it is too soon to know how much of it is really specific to the pandemic. And as I alluded to earlier, our study is going to look at whether it's a temporary rise, right? And more of a temporary rise to a real threat. And what I might predict is that kind of anxiety is, or not, I won't predict, I'll say that kind of anxiety is normative. and it's good because it'll keep us safe. It's going to be watching to see how many kids in the study we're doing stay elevated who probably wouldn't have been otherwise. That's going to be the real test of the effects of the pandemic on anxiety rates in kids.
Okay. That may suggest an answer to this next question, but I was thinking about interventions in this moment with our kids, and especially some of our younger kids. I sit down and I watch the news, and it's different with my college student and with my freshman in high school, and it would be different with an 8-year-old. And in thinking about the different pathways to anxiety, some of it's community, and that's the news. Some of it is through the parents, and that would maybe suggest I shouldn't be watching the news with the kids. That's an intervention, a change that I could undertake. So should we be shielding as best we can our kids from thinking about the pandemic because it's going to lead some of them to heightened anxiety that might be problematic in the long term? Or is the protective aspect perhaps, and the understanding aspect perhaps, more important?
It's kind of more nuanced than that, right? Shouldn't do one extreme or the other, and it's age dependent, right? The younger the kids, the less information you want to give them, but you still want to give them information that's age appropriate. So talking about, I remember reading really early on, the advice around a 2 or 3-year-old, they can understand the concept of germs. We're staying away from grandma and grandpa because of germs, and we don't want to give them germs. There's bad, and you explain it at a level that they understand because they know something's different. Why aren't mommy and daddy working? Why, what's going on? So completely shielding them might actually inadvertently increase their concern about what's going on. And then as kids get older, you can share, again, age appropriate things and engage the age of your child. I mean, like you, Scott, I've got a high school student and a college student. So we, everything's wide open and, discussions, they're not being shielded from that. In fact, they're probably getting more exposure to it than I am getting because they have, their own means. And then I think the most important thing to remember for parents is to just give the children a chance to talk about what it is that they're seeing and hearing, and make sure that they know that they're you're gonna do the best you can, you're there to support them, etc. And it is then also important to shield them from the worst of your own anxieties and feelings and thoughts about it too. Is that helpful?
Yes. So as you look ahead to the next waves of research, and we've got groups in Harrisburg that you're studying, we've got Penn State students potentially, hopefully, eventually returning to campus. How will some of our students potentially be involved in this? And are there direct ways, either through their involvement in research or just being included in surveys, either that they are included or that they can help with some of this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. My lab, and I probably maybe could have said this at the beginning, I have a huge lab with tons of student support. So I have 6 or 7 graduate students usually at any one time working on my projects, and I have usually around 12 or so undergraduates working in the lab on these projects doing various tasks. Even in Harrisburg, we have started, that's mainly staffed by paid research staff, but we have started an internship program with Penn State Harrisburg students, for them to get the same experience as the University Park undergraduates do. I currently have 2 honors students in my lab, and both are working on projects. They're going into their senior year, so they're working on projects with the data from the adolescent anxiety project that I was telling you about. One is pre-med, and he's particularly interested in the stress physiology and how that manifests itself for kids who are really anxious around their peers and kids who are not. And then the other students really interested in parenting and how parents monitor their children. So earlier I was talking about protecting kids, that, telling your 9-year-old he doesn't have to go to the birthday party kind of thing. But for adolescents, it looks a little different. It's, do I know where my kid is? How closely do I monitor their friendships and what they do? So she's really interested in that. And we've had great success with our students doing really great projects, either for their honors thesis or presenting them at conferences. I often take 1 or 2 of my best undergrad students to conferences with us. Now, what will happen in the next year, in terms of conferences remains to be seen. But that's something I think is really important. And it also provides my graduate students with the opportunity to mentor and to learn how to mentor. So we sort of have this sort of system where all of the undergraduates would report to a graduate student supervisor, and then we get together as a big lab and discuss things too.
So another question. Uncertainty is a major feature of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
We have gotten different advice over time. We've started to reopen when some numbers might say that's a good thing and other numbers might not. We've thought asymptomatic transmission was a big deal. Yesterday, the WHO had a study that said, well, it's not as big a deal as we thought, the same with surfaces. So we're getting different advice, and there's still a lot of unknowns because this is a new disease. It's 6 or 8 months old as far as we know. So does that uncertainty about what we're facing work in a different way? Because it's not as if we can pull out a handbook and say, here's everything you need to know.
Right.
And we can then be factually based in how we're talking.
Yeah, this is really tough, and it's something that I've actually been thinking about, because we're always uncertain. It's just that this level of uncertainty or what's happening right now is, it's very clear that nobody really knows what's going to happen, right? But I actually think parents, especially parents of anxious kids, can use this as an opportunity to say, we need to trust the experts. We need to trust, let's say, our school district, that they're making all the decisions that they need to keep you safe, but at the same time get us back to some sense of normalcy, right? Because we can't continue to stay in our homes for the next 12 months until there's a vaccine. We have to get out and do something. So it actually would provide, it does provide this opportunity to both, how do we be cautious in a world that's got real risks, but also do what we need to do, and provide the opportunity to get kids to see that things by and large will be okay. Not necessarily forever. I'm not saying people won't get sick, but that in general, right, this is going to be okay, and we're going to be okay, and we're doing the best we can, and the experts are doing the best they can with the information that they have. It's kind of a real world learning opportunity for all of us to realize that nobody has all the answers.
Does being proactive and undertaking some activity in response even to this uncertainty, we're not sure if it's this or this, but we can undertake this action that will make us safer, does that help reassure people?
Yes, I think so, right? And that's actually part of what would be in a behavioral treatment for anxiety, right? Now I need to take some power back about my own behavior, or take some level of control. One of the things about anxiety is that you feel this lack of control, this lack of power over your world. But there are things you can do. You can control how you interact with that situation, how you approach that situation. So it provides an opportunity to give some tools. So maybe we decide, and this is a conversation I've been having with my 16-year-old who's not anxious, but is we have to make choices about the things that we do. We can't snap our fingers and go back to normal. So if you're going to do this, you're going to be practicing with the baseball team, then maybe you don't hang out with your friends every day like you have to make choices. And I'm empowering him to make those choices, right? So there is things that we could do, and giving anxious children especially some control over what those things that they can do are, that'll make them less anxious.
Another pandemic question as we get close to wrapping up. So if anyone has a last question and they want to throw it out, please do. We're now approaching return to work, and we're reopening, going to restaurants and various sorts of things. And there's new anxiety about that process. It's not just, will I get it from going to the grocery, but what about work, and what do we do there, and what about parents and children? Do we need to think about things any differently as we go from sort of lockdown to reopening with different uncertainties and concerns?
I think it's kind of all of the same. I think now the difference here is that it's not just, maybe I'm having to manage how my child's going to navigate all of this, but now I'm managing it on my own. So for all of us, it's about finding those ways that we have power, and making the choices that allow us to, to not allow us to engage in the ways that we have to, and where we have choice, make those choices that fit ourselves, our, our priorities the best. So it's almost like we have to treat all of ourselves as being anxious. And I had, we talk about it as anxiety. I talk about good anxiety in this case, but it's almost right now with the pandemic closer to fear, right? Because it's not about anxiety, this thing that could happen. There is a threat. And so we do have to figure out ways to manage that are no different than the ways I was discussing helping your child manage it.
Okay. Let me end with the last broad question, coming back to the really big picture, because we've been focused on the immediate moment for a bit. So you talked in the research about how early symptoms can emerge among children, perhaps even at age 2.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, there hasn't been that much time for kids to have environmental or community factors affecting them, although certainly for 2 years there has been. How do you can you judge the relative effect of perhaps a genetic predisposition versus a family influence versus a neighborhood influence versus a community? Can we say one is more important than the other? Does it vary? Does it vary over time?
It varies, and it varies over time, right? It can't be a one size. We know there's genetics, right? We know that anxious parents are more likely to have anxious kids. But we also know that anxious adoptive parents, are also more likely to rear anxious kids. So it isn't just genetics, it is environmental. One of the studies I didn't talk about is a study that I do in collaboration with Coralie Perez Edgar in my department, and a colleague of ours at Rutgers. We have a 3-site study where we're looking at the development of attention processes and negative affect from 4 months to 2 years. And what's interesting is that we're finding that high negative affect, really being a reactive baby, leads to what we call an attention bias to threat pattern. So they tend to develop a pattern of attending to threat in their environment more quickly than other infants do. And then that in turn will lead to this fearful temperament I was talking about early. But what we're showing, because we have 3 sites, Harrisburg, Newark, and University Park, is that for infants who are in communities of higher risk, it's the community risk that seems to be predicting their attention bias. So even though the infant themselves isn't directly experiencing the environments, they're experiencing their community environments through the family context. And like that slide I showed earlier, through potentially mom's own anxiety and stress. So it's a little bit of both, and it kind of depends on the context. And what I was trained as a temperament researcher. It was all about the individual risk. And what I've come to learn over the last 20 years is how powerful the impact of the environment is in shaping that for different types of kids.
Okay. It's never easy.
No, no, but
We
it's
have
what
some
keeps,
kids.
yeah, what keeps me able to keep doing my research, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're making progress. All right. Well, thank you, Kristen. I'm afraid we're going to have to end things
Yeah, this was
today.
great. Thank you so much.
Stay there. Thanks for the thought-provoking presentations, and thanks for the questions from everybody, and thanks for joining us today. Our a final reminder, our third presentation in this series will be next Wednesday, June 17th at 12:05. That'll be Ray Block speaking about 2020 elections and race politics in the pandemic. I hope to see you there virtually. So have a great day, everybody, and a good week. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.